the Maduro regime was an illegitimate occupying regime. He lost the elections 2024, but for decades they had been used to state capacity, the military, the bases, to facilitate narco-terrorism. This means providing funding, transporting illicit narcotics and other materials for these organizations. Now, the United States is not alleging that Venezuela is the key to every bit of drugs that comes into the United States, but it is a linchpin, all because they use the entire state of Venezuela, which is very large, by the way, to transport narcotics, to house extra hemispheric powers that want to do the United States harm. So when people make the argument, or pundits make the argument, oh, well, not all the fentanyl is coming through Venezuela. Well, that is true. But they're in league with those who do bring it into the United States from Mexico.
Welcome to Reaganism. This is Roger Zakheim, director of the Reagan Institute. We're excited to kick off 2026 with a good friend of the Reagan Institute, Joseph Ledford, who is assistant director of the Hoover History Lab, where he is a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's also somebody with great knowledge and expertise in the Western Hemisphere. He comes at it through the lens of history, but he works in the world of applied history. So is somebody who can give really good insight into everything that is going on between the United States and Venezuela, and more broadly, U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Roger, and what a new year it's been. I'm always glad to be welcomed either at the Reagan Institute or on the Reagan Institute's fine podcast. This new year has started off with a bang, so to speak.
No doubt. And we were just kibitzing before recording this, but you're someone, and maybe you can take a minute or two to talk about your background and interest in foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere. But with President Trump's decision to remove Maduro from power in Venezuela, all of a sudden the whole media apparatus is focusing on, of course, Venezuela, U.S. policy in the region, and they're looking for experts. And you're an expert, but a lot of people going on and sounding off on this, perhaps prior to this operation, didn't know much about the Western Hemisphere. How did you come to focus in this region of the world?
Roger, that's an astute point. Many of us, like myself, well, I would say not many, few of us in the so-called blob had been making the case that the United States had neglected its neighbors. And I would say the last few decades have been an outlier in American history. Certainly wasn't the case during the Reagan administration that the Western Hemisphere was ignored. Perhaps we can return to that. In my own case, as an undergraduate, I had quite an interest in Cold War history. I'm of the age of being old enough to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, but being young enough to be a member of the Generation 9/11 who come of age after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001. And when I began reflecting on the Cold War period, particularly the Reagan administration, Central America, Latin America comes to the fore. I had the opportunity as an undergraduate to take a study abroad excursion to Cuba during the brief period in which students were allowed to visit for educational purposes, although that certainly was not the case. For the Cuban government, it was the case for me, but seeing the horrors of dictatorship, communist dictatorship firsthand, and Cuba playing such an outsized role since the Cuban Revolution in American foreign policy, it captured my interest, my intellectual interest. As a graduate student at Berkeley, I wrote a dissertation on the Iran-Contra affair, which I'm turning into a forthcoming book.
We'll have you back on for that one. You'll have to tell us when that comes out. We're excited about that.
Yes, I will be back for that, and it's close to being finalized. So spending the better part of a decade studying Reagan's Latin American policy, particularly in Central America, I had an interest in public policy and had obviously been in the media recently and in front of the United States Senate speaking about it as one of the only few people who had been making the case that the United States should pay attention to the Western Hemisphere. The late great Secretary of State George Shultz had a saying, foreign policy starts in your own neighborhood.
And this has, of course, been sort of, as you said just at the outset, it's been the exception to American foreign policy over the past 2 decades. But prior to that, starting with the Monroe Doctrine, perhaps before and then after, the United States foreign policy has almost begun, has been the focus has been within its hemisphere. The Trump administration, both in its first form and then certainly in its current form since January of 2025, was absolutely focused on the region. It's been a big part. It's been a big slice of the so-called MAGA foreign policy. It's central to the national security strategy that was released towards the end of 2025. Before we jump into what took place in Venezuela and capturing Maduro, why don't you scene set, Joseph, the policy framework, the approach the Trump administration has articulated prior to this operation as it relates to Venezuela and Western Hemisphere, and to what extent it's consistent with what we saw from, let's say, the Reagan, the 1980s, and through George H.W. Bush up through before 9/11.
The capture of Maduro is a culmination of a policy that started day one. January 20th, 2025, the president issued a slew of executive orders, and amongst those were designating transnational criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, principally the Sinaloa cartel, MS-13, and others located in all of them located in the Western Hemisphere, declaring an emergency at the southern border and making it the case that the United States Armed Forces' principal mission is defense of the homeland. So you had the predicate for the policy laid day one. In the president's inaugural speech, he mentioned the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal has been the premier national security interest for the United States in the Western Hemisphere before it was ever built. We can go back to the 1880s when there were French designs on building a canal, and the United States asserted itself that any interoceanic canal created in the hemisphere would be in the province of the United States. So President Trump made it clear at the outset that we would recover the Panama Canal from Chinese influence or extirpate Chinese influence from Panama. President appointed Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio, as listeners of the podcast would know, is probably the chief expert on the Western Hemisphere from his days into the Senate and now in the administration. Marco Rubio appointed Christopher Landau, the former ambassador to Mexico, with deep expertise in the region, to be Deputy Secretary of State for a reason. Marco has to pay attention to the entire world, and he wanted the second in command to be able to focus on the Western Hemisphere while Marco carries out his duties as Secretary of State. I would note that this may be the first time in American history that the nation's 2 chief diplomats are bilingual in Spanish with deep expertise in the region. Secretary Rubio took his first trip abroad to Central America. That was the first time since 1912 that a Secretary of State had visited that part of the world. I'll note Secretary of State George Shultz, when he joined the administration in July 1982, visited Canada and Mexico, and that was the decision of the Reagan administration, laying the groundwork for NAFTA, but also prioritizing the Western Hemisphere. So in personnel and policy, the president had appointed people that were quite interested in the Western Hemisphere and understood its importance to American national security. I also make note here about Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. It's hard to deny the smile on his face when he visited the jungle course that has been revived in Panama. And I believe Secretary Hegseth orients towards the Western Hemisphere more so than other theaters, although he is focused on the Indo-Pacific.
Let's just talk about it for a second, because you're demonstrating how there's a lot of continuity and certainly focus from the outset. Yeah. But it does reflect a streak of Trump foreign policy, which the Trump administration would say was a significant corrective, I think, from what they would say establishment foreign policy of both Republican and Democratic administrations had advanced, which is to look past the region, as you've noted, but not just that they look past the region, it's that these previous administrations, the judgment of the Trump administration, really overlooked American sovereignty. That 101 of protecting a country, protecting our country, is you got to make sure the borders are secure and the neighborhood is not threatening your interests. That goes to a core streak of, sort of nationalist conservatism that I think is driving everyone from the president to Stephen Miller in the White House to Pete Hegseth, to Marco Rubio, perhaps, maybe is more traditional in his outlook towards Western Hemisphere or less nationalist in orientation. But comment on that element, because that is a bit of a departure, I think. It's certainly the way they think and approach it than we've seen in quite some time.
Roger, that's another astute point. The core issues to Trump's political agenda, migration, narcotics, confronting China, reciprocal trade, where do they emanate principally? The Western Hemisphere. So from the beginning of when Donald Trump came down the golden escalator over a decade ago and announced his run for the highest office in the land, those issues were in the forefront of his political agenda. Those are also issues that, if you look at poll after poll, concerned Americans. Americans may not always articulate it in the way we do regarding the Western Hemisphere, but illegal immigration, drugs, crime, those were issues in which President Trump won voters, and he won again in the election in November 2024. And so it has animated President Trump's domestic political agenda from the beginning. So it should be no surprise that it's reflected in his foreign policy. And I do think there's a different orientation from the MAGA movement, from President Trump, about the focus on the region. Let's say it's quite different from George W. Bush, who was the last president who really focused on the Western Hemisphere, much like his father before him, concerned with the relationship with Mexico. And Bush had quite, I think, a lot of success that he doesn't get credit for, the Merida Initiative, CAFTA DR, and others, but also the beginnings of the problems with Hugo Chavez, and then later, when he died, Nicolas Maduro. So in some ways, President Trump is both carrying forward older policy platform of the GOP, but in a new iteration. But he's resolving longstanding challenges. I mentioned earlier the Cuban Revolution. What President Trump is, we should think of it like Michael Corleone in The Godfather. He's settling all accounts in the Western Hemisphere, beginning with Caracas. I think it would be helpful for the podcast listeners to think about Caracas replaced Havana. What Cuba was during the Cold War for America's enemies, Venezuela became for America's enemies in the 21st century.
That's really interesting and helpful. And of course, we're seeing reporting that there were over 30 Cuban nationals who were killed in the operation. And there's been speculation that Venezuela and Maduro, the Maduro regime, was in some respects propped up, secured, or in some ways driven by the Cuban regime. I don't know if you have a particular point of view on that, Joseph, but the interaction between Venezuela and Cuba is certainly something there's a more popular understanding of, and it's not limited to the world of the intelligence community or the experts, just based on the number of nationals that seem to be surrounding Maduro at the time of the operation.
Yes, that's correct, Roger. Secretary Rubio said it best. Venezuela was colonized by Cuba. Cuba built the security infrastructure. Cuba run its intelligence. Cuban bodyguards surrounded Maduro. If Miguel Diaz-Canel says there's 32 Cubans, there's probably 65 who died in the operation confronting Delta Force. Of course, I somewhat jest, but the Cubans had infiltrated every level of Venezuelan society. This is not just my own conjecture. If you listen to the Venezuelan opposition, Maria Corina Machado has said this for years. They're deeply interlinked with many of our other enemies. Iran, for example. Iran and Hezbollah has used Venezuela as a launching pad for their nefarious activities in the Western Hemisphere, in which they operate in the tri-border region, engaged in everything from murder and drug trafficking and arms trafficking to raise millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to finance terrorism against our allies in the Middle East, namely Israel. So this is not simply what critics of President Trump's foreign policy have said is a move towards isolationism or retrenchment. If I can make a broader point about this for the rest of the world, and kind of an internationalist point, what happens in Venezuela matters to our European allies and our Middle Eastern allies. It's a global issue. The cocaine that is produced in Colombia, which, by the way, produces more cocaine today than they ever have. And Pablo Escobar could not dream of the amount of cocaine that is produced in Colombia, that is then trafficked using the state facilities of Venezuela through Africa to Europe, funds and fuels the transnational crime that's besieging France and Brussels. Listeners may not be following, but Marseille and Brussels are experiencing a crime wave far worse than any city in the United States. Their own officials have called it terrorism. Brussels is considering deploying troops, or Belgium is considering deploying troops to the streets of Brussels. France has passed new drug laws. So in a way, resolving the Maduro problem helps our European allies. And I don't think that's said enough. And then secondarily, it removes the springboard for Iranian operations. I'll note that the Venezuelan opposition since 2020 has had a memorandum of understanding with the Likud party, principally around security issues. And Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu has mentioned this recently in praising the operation.
So clearly the transnational narco-terrorist network is an element that the axis of, autocrats have been leveraging and coordinating with, as you've outlined, and so it spans the globe. But let's stay in the hemisphere.
Sure.
And I'd like to kind of break up the conversation now in two parts. Let's talk about the operation, the rationale, the manner in which it was carried out, and then we'll get to what's next and the challenges facing U.S. diplomacy and what Venezuela will look like. But on the operational side, Joseph, were you surprised that they decided, as the Trump administration decided that, hey, we just have to go ahead and remove Maduro and bring him to the United States for prosecution? Obviously, him and his wife were indicted in U.S. federal court. There was obviously big military presence build up for a significant period of time, a lot of pressure, conversations between the U.S. and Maduro, seeing if he would be willing to leave and go to Syria or Russia. That didn't play out. Give me your take on the decision to use the military option.
I was not surprised, and I said in public and in writing, forecasted that I thought this would be the case. I was surprised at how charitable President Trump was to Maduro. He gave him more opportunities than he deserved to leave the country. Maduro was not interested in that. This began early in the administration. I'll set the scene for listeners. President Trump entered office clearly determined to take on transnational crime, to elevate it not as a law enforcement problem, but as a national security mission, which I think is transformative in a way that we haven't fully appreciated yet. But President Trump tried in the beginning to reach a form of détente with Venezuela, taking deportation flights, curbing drug trafficking, minimizing weaponized migration. He gave the Venezuelan regime, the Maduro regime, an opportunity to reach some understanding with the United States. And of course, they were not interested in that, but he tried. And that's President Trump's first instinct, is he says he'll talk to anybody, and he does. And he gave Maduro an opportunity. Simultaneously, we had a buildup in the Southern Caribbean, especially beginning in August, Operation Southern Spear. We moved a tremendous amount of naval and air assets into the region. There have been strikes and ongoing strikes against narco-laden vessels. And I want to mention Mexico here for a second because it's part of the equation.
Sure.
Where the Sinaloa cartel is the chief adversary of the United States regarding transnational criminal organizations. This is the DEA's words, not mine. I mean, this is the position of the government. I think listeners should think about the Sinaloa cartel as 10 times worse than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. They have several 100,000 members. They're armed to the teeth. They make billions of dollars. They operate around the globe. They have operatives in every state, but they are in league with the Maduro regime regarding narcotics trafficking.
There's a lot of skepticism about this because, there's fentanyl doesn't come out of Venezuela. Only 10% of the world's cocaine comes out of Venezuela. Take us through
Sure.
the best argument that the indictment through which we're seeing the prosecution of Maduro is very much tied to narcotics, and that he is a relevant and actually a key actor in the fight against narco-terrorism.
Sure. And this goes to the build-up to the decision to go into Venezuela and capture him. I would encourage everyone to go read the 25-page superseding indictment against Nicolas Maduro. He was originally indicted in 2020. They can read that too. The state capacity of Venezuela had been used to assist not only the Sinaloa cartel, but Tren de Aragua, Zetas, and others. So the narco-terrorism charge, FARC, ELN, the guerrilla groups in neighboring Colombia. The Maduro regime was an illegitimate occupying regime. He lost the elections of 2024. But for decades, they had been used, the state capacity, the military, the bases, to facilitate narco-terrorism. This means providing funding, transporting illicit narcotics and other materials for these organizations. Now, the United States is not alleging that Venezuela is the key to every bit of drugs that comes into the United States, but it is a linchpin, all because they use the entire state of Venezuela, which is very large, by the way, to transport narcotics, to house extra hemispheric powers that want to do the United States harm. So when people make the argument, or pundits make the argument, oh, well, not all the fentanyl is coming through Venezuela. Well, that is true. But they're in league with those who do bring it into the United States from Mexico. And they facilitate the transportation of those drugs from the Western Hemisphere to Africa and Europe. And they provide funding to those groups.
With respect to the military operation, Joseph, to me, the best analogy, lots of people have pointed to it, but I want to get your take, is the operation in Panama during George H.W. Bush's administration to remove Noriega from power. Unlike the operation we just saw in terms of capturing Maduro, which took a few hours, the Noriega operation took longer. It was days, not hours. But there is a similar sort of rationale. H.W. Bush was not known for being somebody who was talking about, returning freedom to the people of Panama. He is more of a traditional realist in his orientation, very different than President Reagan in that regard. President Trump seems to be following in that tradition and in the rationale and approach of the operation. Certainly not someone who is an administration that's looking for boots on the ground, extended U.S. presence. Kind of reflect on the Noriega operation, and it's a sort of odd bedfellows putting George H.W. Bush with President Trump, although in this respect there seems to be more similarities and differences.
That's a great point, Roger. The similarity is they both would deploy massive, overwhelming military force to achieve the objective and to support the American national interest. In the case of Operation Just Cause in 1989, the difference, we were treaty bound in order to intervene, which some pundits seem to forget when they invoke the analogy between Panama and Venezuela. We already had boots on the ground, so to speak, in Panama, and we had boots on the ground. The operation did take longer. There was more loss of lives, American casualties. But operationally, it was quite different, but rationale very similar. If we take out the treaty bound to uphold the sovereignty of the canal, Bush gave many reasons when he announced the operation in protecting Americans.
A leader was indicted in American court, and in that respect, it's very similar.
Yes. Yeah, rationale is very similar. Indicted, drug trafficking, stolen election, refused to leave, given opportunities to leave. I want to mention Bush gave Noriega opportunities to give himself up. It was last resort, much like President Trump, who uses American force as a last resort. But when he does use American force, he means it. And I think the same is with President H.W. Bush, who was a very serious man and was willing to negotiate, but when he was ready to make a decision, he made it, much like President Trump has. My understanding, and I don't want to be quoted on this, is the administration is relying on an OLC opinion from Bill Barr regarding the current operation in Venezuela that was used from Panama, because it was a joint force operation. So in Venezuela, it was JSOC operation alongside the CIA, the FBI, the DEA, Cybercom, Spacecom. It was like there was not one capability that the United States had that we didn't use, apparently, in order to capture Maduro, to bring him to New York to face prosecution. Similarly, in Panama, Bush used overwhelming force to go in. Of course, Noriega didn't give up right away. It was a different kind of tactical decision than in the Venezuelan operation. So there's loose parallels, but I think the legal rationale is very similar, if not the Trump administration invoking what the Bush administration relied on.
Well, yeah, the Barr memo. He's certainly former Attorney General Bill Barr has been out there talking about it. Is pretty strong. I want to move to what happens next, but I do, before going there, the skill, the expertise, the operational success of our military is really something to behold. Venezuela, as you outlined, it's not China or Russia in terms of its sophistication, military sophistication. But again, there's a military there. Take a minute just to talk about the forced laydown of Venezuela, what that regime looked like in terms of what it looks like in terms of its military. Its worst actors are their Minister of Defense and Minister of Interior. I mean, this is not some sort of weak military and security force that our Delta forces had to overcome.
That's right. It's not the PLA. Okay, but they did have air defenses. They had a security apparatus built by Russia and China and Cuba. Maduro was surrounded by Cuban security forces. Delta Force had to dispatch 32 by the official account, probably more. Originally, reports were, air defenses stood down, but that's not true. We've subsequently seen from the Department of War and video footage that our helicopters, air squadron, received fire, returned fire. The operation itself was very sophisticated. If Venezuelan forces were as decrepit and as useless that has been suggested by critics of the operation, then why did the United States go to the extent that it did to pull off this exceptional and I would say awe-inspiring operation that required so many assets, so much coordination? The chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Kane, made the point that if one aspect of the operation failed, it would all fail. The CIA had been in Venezuela covertly since August, tracking Maduro.
Right.
We knew the names of his pets when he fed his pets. We had penetrated the regime. We built a exact replica of his compound on the military base in Caracas at a classified location in the United States, including the materials. Delta Force was prepared to cut through the safety room through steel doors. And so I dismiss criticisms that Venezuela had no security force. Of course they did. They've had to repress millions of people in their own country, and they had air defenses that seemed to work, but they were no match for United States military power. It was quite impressive. From the Night Stalkers in the sky to the Delta Force on the ground. I think we know over 200 U.S. forces. We actually had boots on the ground. No casualties. Some injuries, but...
All right, I want to move to what's next, and because the military operation was so successful, I mean, you even those who have derangement syndrome of any kind, Trump derangement syndrome, U.S. military derangement syndrome, anti-U.S. derangement syndrome, whatever it is, it's hard to. The cold facts are what they are. It was a hugely successful operation. So now the focus is okay. Well, we're entering this next phase, and it's amateur hour. There is no plan. Now, you started out, Joseph, talking about how Secretary of State Marco Rubio comes to this position, perhaps the most knowledgeable, these are my words, not yours, most expert Secretary of State we've had in the history of our republic as it relates to the Western Hemisphere and to the political, economic, and security issues that the region faces. This is someone who has done a deep dive and is truly expert. And to me, right there, we should have confidence in what's coming next. Now, there's a debate about what we should have. I'll frame this and let you respond and give us your outlook and point of view as to whether or not we should be working with the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, which seems to be the approach for now, whether or not we should be pushing for new elections and bringing in the opposition with Machado immediately, whether or not we need to have boots on the ground because chaos and anarchy is, playing out on the streets of Caracas and elsewhere. That doesn't seem to be the case at the time of this recording. Secretary of State Rubio, I'll end with this, as I understand what he said, listening to him, is like he's looking at this not in a matter of hours, of days, but weeks and months, where there's going to be a transition. And first and foremost, it's about getting the U.S. interest addressed, which is the so-called Trump corollary that came out in the national security strategy, narcotics, not bringing hostile powers into Venezuela, right, not interfering with U.S. interests, and then maybe elections restoring a real democracy to Venezuela. I think let's wait and see, and that seems to be a sound approach, sort of a Bush 41 approach. But give me your take with that framing.
Roger, I agree with that assessment. What I can discern from the public comments that have been made by the Secretary of State and the President and Homeland Security Advisor Stephen Miller and Secretary of State Pete Hegseth is that this was a risk mitigation operation. It's policy by aircraft carrier. I'm hesitant to say gunboat diplomacy because what we're using is far more than just mere gunboats. That the CIA had conducted a risk assessment, an analysis of the political situation that was presented to the president, and he seems to be persuaded by it. And the CIA had determined that it would not be realistic to immediately allow the opposition to take power. The Trump administration had determined that most of the opposition wasn't in the country, that it would bring about more instability, it would require more U.S. forces on the ground, and the president wasn't willing to do that. This was a law enforcement operation to bring Maduro to justice. And then the rest of the regime, the detritus of the regime, can decide what they want to do. The president has made it clear that there'll be more operations if they're not willing to bring about a transitional government. It seems to me that Rubio's has articulated a gradual process return to democracy. The idea that there would be democracy in Venezuela next week is just completely unrealistic. And I'm someone who's wholeheartedly supported the restoration of democracy in Venezuela and have supported intervening in Venezuela to bring Maduro to justice. But we have to be realistic about what the United States can bear, given that we have commitments in other theaters. I had made the point earlier that this is not retrenchment, and it's not. The United States has to be wary about getting engaged in so-called quagmires. But I think from what the administration has said, that President Trump has said 18 months, given that it would take that long with investment to bring oil production in Venezuela back online, to have elections, real elections that can be monitored. So I think it's a wait and see approach, but this is also a wait and see approach with a blockade still in place, with all of those air and naval assets that I spoke about earlier still deployed in the region, and the policy has not changed. So it's an anaconda strategy. The squeeze is still on the regime, and we're dictating the terms and the procedures, and it's up to them. It's their choice. It's not a free country in Venezuela, but it is in America, and we're giving them a free choice of whether or not they want to bring about a democratic transition. And then if they don't, the president is going to use force to make that the case.
We'll see about that in terms of a transition. I think that's an open question. I hope you're right. You make a great point that I think everybody needs to internalize as they think about what's next. And what I'm referring to, Joseph, is, yes, Maduro has been captured. He's being prosecuted in the Southern District of New York. but we're not done. The military assets remain there. The Anaconda strategy, which you've been speaking about publicly for some time, is in effect, and that's the so-called leverage that the president, and specifically Secretary of State Marco Rubio, has been talking about consistently, and is playing out with the blockade. And we, as with the time of this recording, we're going to see whether or not, or how it's being enforced as Venezuela tries to ship out oil, and what else it means with respect to coming in and oil companies and others trying to restore what is reported to be this broken, completely sort of half kind of operational oil industry, energy industry in Venezuela. You have he had a great line I saw where he said, "Delta Force and dollar supremacy, American power endures," and I think that is, correct me if I'm wrong here, endures meaning beyond the capture of Maduro.
Yeah, that's right. I'm making the point that the United States is not in decline. We hear a lot in Washington and out here in California, oh, it's a multipolar world. Well, what other country could pull off Operation Absolute Resolve?
I agree with that.
And so it's peace through strength. You were speaking about the use of force and diplomacy in tandem, and I think the president and certainly Secretary of State Rubio, they're intent on doing that in this situation. I don't think it was ever in the cards that we would deploy 100,000 troops, that this would be Iraq 2.0. I hate to make predictions, but perhaps we can finally dispense with the ghost of Iraq and get away with the Iraq War syndrome.
Well, I agree with you, and you're right to call it the Iraq War syndrome. Not enough people understand that. It's, of course, you're harking back to the Vietnam syndrome, where people were so traumatized by Vietnam, it actually impacted U.S. foreign policy, where we no longer believe in ourselves to do anything. And, it's a good entry point into discussing, as we close out this conversation, Venezuela and freedom. Because if we were, at this moment, as the U.S., were to go full bore into removing the regime, let's just say that was the approach the Trump administration took, not just Maduro, but the vice president, and everybody else who's supporting the Maduro regime, Minister of Interior, and then we reinstalled, because of our boots on the ground, the opposition, and that backfired in the sense that the people didn't get behind it. It was viewed by the people of Venezuela as a puppet government, illegitimate, just doing the bidding of Washington. I think it would extend, it would reinforce potentially what you call, Joseph, the Iraq syndrome. Now, you take the approach that Secretary Rubio has spoken about, where we're not disbanding the Venezuelan security forces. We're putting leverage on the existing regime, and we anticipate and expect that we'll use that leverage to have a transition to a free and fair election. Then all of a sudden we've restored confidence here that this Iraq syndrome that says that we can't be involved in the affairs of our hemisphere and the world actually is incorrect. There's a better way of doing business, and one that we could accomplish our objectives, frankly, in a way that is optimal, that we always should seek to do. I think that's the opportunity here, Joseph.
That's correct, Roger. I think it's a grand opportunity. Venezuela is not Iraq. Venezuelans have been fighting for democracy for over 2 decades. There's a legitimate democratic opposition that won over 70% of the vote on July 28, 2024. This isn't regime change. This is democratic restoration, and President Trump has a different way of going about it. Every regime change operation doesn't have to be 500,000 troops and full military involvement, provisional government, de-Baathification. The United States is conducted these kinds of operations in different forms. President Reagan brought about democratic restoration, or democracy, brought about democracy and dictatorships in many countries around the world throughout the 1980s. Namely, he supported the democratic opposition against Augusto Pinochet in Chile towards the end of his second term. So I think we give the administration time and the breathing room to see if the policy is a success before we say it's a failure, before we criticize that the democratic opposition isn't in power. There's a right way and a wrong way to go about this. And currently, I think the administration is making a prudent approach that doesn't require 500,000 forces inside Venezuela.
I know we got to wrap up here. I want to jump to our lightning round quickly, but before we do so, I need 1 minute from you on Cuba, because there has been chatter about what's next. I mean, the president has been talking about Greenland. They've been talking about Iran. We're not going to touch those, but Cuba has come up, and not just from the president. Secretary of State Rubio has been saying the same. Give me your hot take on what should be U.S. policy towards Cuba now with the Maduro regime, Maduro out and potentially the regime out.
Well, I think the policy is going to be no quarter, in the sense that there's going to be continued pressure on the Cuban regime. As Secretary of State Rubio said, if I were in the government and in Havana, I would be quite concerned. I think that's my position too. I think the administration is going to continue to put the pressure, or as I called it, the anaconda strategy on the Cuban regime, but also Nicaragua. I think the administration looks at Caracas, Managua, and Havana is, it's a three-leg stool of a lot of our problems, most of our problems in the region, and they're trying to resolve them in one fell swoop. This can't be done overnight, but I do think we should look forward to mostly probably covert action, perhaps more sanctions against the Cuban regime and on individuals associated with the regime.
We have Argentina, we have Bolivia, we have Ecuador. These countries have all turned away from leftist governments. And now we have Venezuela, a great opportunity to advance freedom in the region, which always complements our U.S. national security interests. Joseph Ledford will go to the lightning round. Thanks for lending your expertise to the conversation here at Reaganism. Here's where we ask for your favorite Reagan quote, speech, book. You can give us all three, two, or just one. What do you have?
I'll start with the book. William N. Bowden, a frequent guest of the Reagan podcast, The Peacemaker. I think it's the best book on Reagan's foreign policy, but I mention it for a reason. Will makes the case of the centrality of Latin America to Reagan's foreign policy in that book. And if listeners, for some reason, haven't read it, I would encourage them to read it, specifically those chapters in which Will covers how Reagan approached the Western Hemisphere. A favorite speech? I'm going to go with the August 17th, 1992 Republican National Convention speech.
Post-presidency. All right.
Post-presidency. It is an interesting speech because it is a political speech. Reagan still had it. It's a roaring endorsement of George H.W. Bush, but it's also a reflection on the American century. Reagan talks about everything that he had experienced in his life, from seeing streets with Model Ts to meeting people who had been to the moon. And he makes the case that Americans should not trade our tomorrows for America's yesterdays. It's an incredibly optimistic speech, pure Reaganism about where the United States is headed and why we should be eternally optimistic about the United States. And I would encourage all listeners to go watch the speech, read the speech, and you'll be more grateful that Reagan was the 40th president of the United States.
Great place to end there. Joseph Ledford, thanks for joining the show, lending your expertise here. Great to see you out there talking about what our country is doing in the Western Hemisphere, and look forward to having you back on.
Thank you, Roger.